know only one word in Italian, which is peccato that I don't speak Italian. But I'm super happy to be here. Milan is one of my favorite cities, and Italy is definitely one of my favorite countries. So I have total envy that I'm not living here. So I thought what I would do today is just discuss a little bit what we recently started thinking about, what I briefly mentioned, the idea of solid or massive form, rather than architecture, because you saw already so much of the architecture. So I have a little thing that I'm not going to read from writing, but I have a little statement which I thought would be fun. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about solids. So after this little introduction, I wrote this little article when Elle magazine asked me, what is going on in design, and can you give us what you think is interesting in objects and in interiors, and what is going on? What do you want to talk about? And I started thinking about it, and I thought, I have nothing to say. You know, architecture, furniture, I'm not sure. And then suddenly I found one thing, and I made this big decision that I realized that we had been looking at the same thing for years. So this is what I wrote. There is a new interest in the body, in the solid, in massive form. No longer minimal, light and thin, but full-bodied, soft, glowing, and sometimes transformative. These solids give us comfort, ground us, and wrap us in a soft embrace. They are not anonymous, cold and sleek, but they have character, identity, and make us smile. They're not overly serious, but yet often are a feat of great engineering, new material ecologies, and groundbreaking production methods. In short, they stand for innovation. So that was kind of the little short thing I wrote, and I guess this is what we try when we build buildings or when we develop industrial design objects, which we sometimes do, not very often, to try and think, how do you make shapes that are constantly negotiating you as a person, but also how do we make buildings that have more than just being a building, have character and identity. And the thinking about solids started when we were, as I said, a frustrated car designer, when we started thinking of thinking that the inside of the house could be a hyperactive solid that would solve all the pragmatic functions of the house. A little bit like a motorbike seat would negotiate the body, the human body, to the hard shell of the building. And then the house would just loosely wrap around this industrial design object that contained everything a house needs: heating, cooling, showers, cooking. There was a skylight in there. It has a fireplace. So essentially solving everything. The idea of the new solid or the massive. I think what is interesting about that is that we came from modernism, where everything was super light and super thin and super minimal. And I think we're going back to things which are more heavy, maybe more almost like human and cuddly and approachable. But in the same time, these massive forms or these new solids are also
super innovative and have new material aspects. So they're not kind of dumb forms, they're actually smart solids. So they're kind of a combination of a lot of different things that I think suddenly, because manufacturing has changed so much and design has changed so much, it's kind of happening all over the world, I think. But it's new in architecture, and I think that's what fascinates me. It happens a lot in furniture design already, but I think in architecture it's just beginning, and I think it's an interesting phase to come up there. What I find more interesting in architecture is to really think of how we live and work in the future and what environment we can create, which is kind of different than what we have now. Architecture is a bit of a turtle, right? It's a very slow-moving profession. And we in the office focus a lot on progress that is made in industrial design and car design, and to see how we can implement that in the detailing of buildings and furniture. So we work a lot with one of the largest independent car designers in the US, who has a gigantic factory. And we love making prototypes and developing projects with him, or with them. So our office is very tightly grouped with offices like that, but also with a lot of very innovative manufacturers that either we develop materials with, or they come to us with a new material they developed, and we kind of integrate it in a new project. We're kind of fearless, so we tend to use very new projects without having gone through a lot of testing. But having worked with very responsible and very innovative manufacturers, we feel, as long as they feel that it's a good material, we like to partner up with people like that. So I think that kind of collaborative approach has moved the architecture, or we hope has moved our architecture and our projects forward quite a bit relative to other buildings. So. And I love to do that in the future, and I think that's also a model people should follow more. You know, I think it's really the time that collaborations become more important than the architect as the hero. I totally don't believe in that, and I think, if anything, it's our office that does everything together, or offices, together with manufacturers and car designers. So that's really what we think is the most relevant in architecture.
For the first time, I think, in architecture, that we thought, let's try and make something like as smart as a car and as comfortable as a car, and something that is much more smooth and much more maybe like a pebble on the beach, rather than something that is necessarily made in straight shapes. What we try and do is use materials that can weather naturally, but still look kind of interesting, or kind of look really interesting and have depth and meaning. So in the case of Vestry Street, the stone was also part of, it was in a landmark district, so we had to come up with how did we feel it fit in the neighborhood, and the neighborhood of Tribeca is very much traditionally made from stone and cast iron. So we proposed to do it from steel and stone, and found the stone that was traditionally used. That's how I ended up in Portugal, because that was the only one quarry that had that stone still, because it was in the old days in many more places, but no more. So we found only that one quarry. The way we find new materials is very often because we work with many manufacturers on developing new things, or they come to us to say, hey, do you want to use it? I mean, we're quite fearless, so we have used very new materials without knowing any other buildings that were used to or built with it. So manufacturers slowly know that now, and they know that we are interested in developing kind of an architecture around it or develop a concept with it. But it also has to work in what you're researching at that point. But we have a whole catalog of people we work with very often that do amazing things. So it's for us also super inspirational to work with manufacturers and to see people that can develop things on such a high level that we architects don't necessarily can, but is super inspirational to work with those people. So we like to keep those people really close to us. Another thing which we realized is to approximate something that is more of industrial design, you have to go away from making representational models, small models, and work more with prototyping. So a lot of the time we work with manufacturers, sometimes even before we meet a contractor, actually very often before we meet a contractor, because I feel like the power of the architect is when you develop something with a manufacturer and you know what you're doing before you get to the contractor. Contractors are productive and good, but they are not necessarily very inventive if you want to do something more difficult. Of course, you know, as in architecture, you go from thinking about something that used to be a drawing. This is a photo of the building, but used to be a drawing. And then you have to go here and figure out which slab of stone you thought was a good idea to have. And I remember standing in this quarry somewhere in Portugal going like, what color is that? It's like a really, really big, daunting task. And then they go to a block like this and they spray a tiny bit of water on it and they say, that color. And basically, after asking whether the guy had a hose of water, which he didn't, we did our best and we found some blocks that worked for the facade. I actually studied sculpture before architecture. So it also gives my big weakness that I cannot think flat at all. So when I said in the movie, you know, normal architects think in plans and section, I can't because I don't think in plans and section. I see it in my head. So it's really difficult because if I would have to work with my office, and they're hugely important, of course, in all these processes, I can't explain it to them, so I basically always work 3D in the computer and in models because it's much easier to discuss it with the office that way. And we sketch in the computer, so literally we sketch in the computer, then we print it out, we talk about it in a big meeting, we sketch maybe by hand also on it, then it goes back in the computer again, so it goes back and forth for quite a while. We 3D print some models in between. We actually do more models for the development of the project than for presentation. The big models you saw in the office, they're actually made by our developers, not by us. And they're sales models. And then when the building is done, the client calls usually and goes, do you want a model? I said, sure. You know, so we have some really gigantic buildings in our office that are just made by the client to help sell the building. We don't make those. We actually believe more in making the models to study the design process and to test that what we did in the computer is actually valuable and good. But it's nice, I think, with working 3D in the computer is that you take many decisions at the same time, but it puts a massive pressure on the office people, the team, to also be able to think like that. What is really interesting about digital, and I have
worked always digital in 3D design. Really, we sketch in the computer, and then we take it out of the computer, we sketch by hand on top of it, we put it back in the computer. So we really work 3D in the computer. And in history, we've had phases where, for example, in the Baroque, there was a massive hyper ornamentation and detailing of architecture, whereas then in modern times, it became like the complete erasure of ornament and kind of hyper articulation. I think what is really interesting about the digital is that we, rather than applying ornaments onto surfaces, in digital design, you can actually put patterns and 3D volumetric approaches to surfaces straight into the building surface itself. So it's no longer applied, but it actually is part of the creation of the building itself. So we think that that is one of the most amazing things, and it also makes that we can use natural materials or recycled materials in really interesting ways. So there's a lot of either mold making and form and pouring of recycled materials, or sometimes where we use recycled wood, and like the store we did in Shanghai, where we recycled an old wood Chinese house, and we had it robotically CNC milled, which we then did not sand down, we just rubbed down with oil and silver powder. And it became this really intense, rich texture that was actually just made by robots, but looked ancient.
The craftsmanship, I think, is amazing, because what I love about working that way is that rather than applying ornaments on a building or applying patterns on a building, is that the surfaces themselves can already have a texture or a pattern built in the surface itself. So a lot of times when we 3D print something or we make walls, then we can easily have it CNC'd or whatever, and the buildings will have texture automatically. So that's we call that digital, or many people call it digital craft, and I think it's something that is only beginning. I think that will hopefully see a lot more. And often we try and do that with recycled material. We did a shop in Shanghai we basically bought an old Chinese house, wood house that was destroyed. We bought all the wood and then had that robotically CNC'd. So it's quite a strange combination of ancient wood that is very imperfect, but then we robotically CNC'd it, and we didn't sand it, and then rubbed it with silver powder and oil, and you get that strange effect of being very old and very new in the same time. And I think that's often what we look for, to kind of see whether we can get something that feels kind of in the same time ancient and futuristic.
And I love the point where you feel that ancient history meets futuristic design. No? So there is this kind of strange overlap of the super past and the super future, because you get something ancient and something futuristic in the same object. And I think that's a really interesting kind of moment to reach in architecture, where it's not so much anymore about style, but really about collapse of time, and almost like a timeless thing you can make. No? We have had an office always in Europe because we have quite a few European projects, and the interesting thing is that we have as many Europeans in New York as we have Dutch people in Holland. So I think for us it's international to begin with. We always say that our office in New York is just a small United Nations of different countries. But the way we make that kind of a fluid collaboration is whenever we have a project in Europe, we actually design everything in the US. But then the people from Holland come for a few weeks to work with us in New York. Then when we are done with construction drawings, they work the final construction drawings out in Europe and coordinated with local codes and those kind of things, and then help with the site administration. So I fly only, let's say, every 3 weeks, and they go every week. So it's kind of a very tight collaboration, and it's still really the main office is in New York.
This is a little building we're currently building. It is 3 buildings. The first building is an existing townhouse. The second building is a building we built on top of the building. And we thought it was kind of crazy that the extension became almost as large as the existing building. And that was no longer an extension, which threw us sort of in crisis until we realized we could do a third building, which basically we hover over the whole thing. And we call it a climate skin, which allows us to get away from having this weird thing which seems to be an adding up. So it gave a few very funny benefits. It used to have a fire escape, and rather than keeping the fire escape, I told the city that I was keeping the balconies of the fire escape. So this climate skin does not only create a shading for the building and privacy for the building, but there are also balconies behind it. So it kind of cantilevers out over the street, and it's openable, as you can see here. And then in the back of the building, it's a strange little townhouse. It's actually for one family, which is a peculiar house. It's 8 stories, and so hence, when they got twins and a very large stroller, I proposed that we put an elevator in. So here you have, on the right, you have an elevator. We put a large cut in the building so that light could come through the elevator into the stair core. And this is actually now under construction. So you can see the stair flying up all the way and the skylight above it as well. And then on the right, there's a lot of double height spaces, because the benefit of having such a vertical space, which had very small floor plates, is to give a lot of connectivity between the different spaces, so you get a very three-dimensional effect of the building. And this is just a few weeks ago. The scaffolding had to come off because they had a problem with the scaffold being in the way. So for like 2 hours, there was a free view that the contractor quickly took this photo. There's a lot of the shading is still missing. But also what it does, so the building itself has a ton of setbacks, which are following the New York City code. This little guy is a cantilevering meditation room. And then this whole part is actually creating a private room on the top of the building that has some privacy. I myself for a while had a roof deck where I never ever was, because 3 other buildings looked on top of that, and it was really warm. So New York gets a bit hot in the summer. So what is really nice here is that this is all going to have shading, and so also a lot of privacy. So we create kind of a room out of the outside space, which we also do on the front.
This is probably something very Dutch. Because when we study architecture in Holland, there is always the urban scale. There is not an architecture project where you won't look how it fits in the city or how the city reflects back on the building. So this is a very Dutch approach, very not American, because in the US people tend to focus in on one scale and usually even one subject. So you always design hospitals or you focus in on residential. But we kind of, because of our form-finding approach, we really think that the scale is actually less relevant but much more relevant is the design innovation. And this can happen on any scale. So sometimes actually a bigger project can be a much simpler process of designing than a very small, intricate project that has to be super precise and hyper detailed. So we find it kind of almost irrelevant whether it's super large or super small. But I have to say, it depends a little bit on the people in the office and where they come from, whether they find that easy and understandable or not. So we do a lot of training in the office to help people go through this. But since the office is run by 2 Europeans, it's for us more self-evident, let's say.
I'll flip through this really quickly. This is a tower we're working on in Rotterdam. We believe in anomalies, things which are not part of normal. It's part of the thinking of character and identity. And these anomalies create kind of islets or like sky lobbies that are crystals that come from a similar effect on the ground floor and get tracked through the building. So that means that if you stand on the ground floor, you can actually look through these cuts and follow the lineup in the building and start to understand that the upper sky lobbies are part of the lower lobbies. And here you see some examples of that. These are parts of the tower that are the gym for the inhabitants. As you can see here with the pool, there'll be meeting rooms for people to have community meetings in the neighborhood. And here you can see it. It's funny because this is the same street as my architecture school used to be. So it's very, very strange to propose a tower in the same street where I was kind of raised as an architect. But yeah, here you start to see it, and then you also see the seams coming up. And they kind of wrap around the building. So it's very nice to go back to Holland and to hopefully get this tower built soon. And here you see the tracking, so the light will also at night track these sky lobbies.
We always say we don't believe in aesthetics or style. We don't want to follow a style. We really think it's the most important to take a subject and to really rethink it, and then to start developing it. We call it from the inside out. So it's almost like you start from the inside out, and then the project grows into what it wants to be, rather than thinking there is an outside shell and the rest is kind of the secondary kind of result of that. We really build things from the inside out, so that the project in itself gets character or identity. And I think that's super important, that it's not just a building, but there is some sort of level of identity to the building. I think when you start your office, there's 2 approaches. One is you take all the work you can get and you make all the money you can get. And the other approach is to work on just really developing what you want to design and how you want to design it, and go a little bit slower, which we did by, I guess, teaching a lot. But by doing that, what is the benefit is you start to make work you really believe in. So the clients start to find you. That also makes a big difference in the way they approach you. Because once they really appreciate what you make and they choose you because of that, then they tend to be also more respectful and more appreciative. So we find that, well, I find that a better approach. And also I feel, you know, I studied architecture so long that I really think it's super important that we make work that we believe in and that we really feel is experimental and innovative. A lot of our clients come to us because of what we do.
when you do a competition and you win a competition, the jury is not necessarily the client. So it is quite difficult in the beginning to convince the client that what you have done, that's really important for several reasons. So I found that with the Chinese client, it takes almost like going back to the beginning of the competition and work them very slowly through the decisions that you have made, and that you, every time you present, you have to completely go through the same presentation again to kind of get them on board with the decisions and the concept and the thinking through it. Whereas if someone chooses you because of what they already know you have done before, there's much less of that. No, it's always difficult to build things, but I think the fact that they choose you is very different than a competition where the client more or less has to start thinking slowly with you. So that I found is definitely more challenging. Plus, you know, the language barrier, huge. It's not easy.
Well, we focus, and I always say it is, we never call ourselves green architects, but we have always worked on making energy efficient buildings and using either recycled or renewable materials. Because I think we have that responsibility to take care of this, especially as architects, and also because we create environments people live in. One, it makes a better environment for people to live in, but also we can sort of indirectly educate people on being more sustainable and being more responsible. So I've always included this in the way we work. But I see it a little bit like driving a car. You know, if you can't change the gears, you're not a good driver. And I feel if you can't build a building responsibly, you're not a good architect. So for us, it's not a special thing. We feel that this is like one of the basic requirements that it is to be an architect. Yeah. Grazie.